In the high-altitude pass of Silver Creek, Colorado, Officer Silas Thorne and his veteran yellow Labrador, Bane, were the only ones standing between the town and the mountain's fury. Silas was a man of few words, a former mountain rescue specialist who had joined the local force to find peace. Bane was his shadow, a 90-pound Labrador with a coat the color of winter wheat and a nose that had never failed a search. But their department was fractured. Chief Garrett, a man obsessed with cutting costs and showing efficiency, had been pressuring Silas to abandon the patrol of the old logging trails, calling them a drain on the budget. The conflict reached a snapping point when a massive snowfall, a true 100-year storm, hit the valley. While Silas was preparing for a routine sweep, Chief Garrett revoked his vehicle privileges, grounding the canine unit to the station. Garrett claimed the roads were too dangerous, but Silas saw the shift in his eyes. Curiosity turned to sharp empathy when Bane began howling at the north wall of the station, his body vibrating with a frantic energy Silas had only seen once before. Defying a direct command, Silas took his personal gear and set out on foot into the whiteout with Bane. Deep in the timber, they found a sight that shattered Silas's faith in his unit. A mother dog and 6 puppies weren't just lost, they were changed to a rusted logging winch, the metal frozen to their fur. The emotional arc pivoted to pure fear when Silas realized the winch was being used as an anchor for an illegal timber-clearing operation Garrett had been hiding. The betrayal was total. Garrett hadn't grounded Silas for his safety, he had done it to ensure no one saw the dogs or the equipment before the snow buried the evidence. As the wind increased to 70 miles per hour, Silas had to choose, stay and freeze with the dogs or leave them to find help. The suspense peaked when Silas heard the sound of a snowcat approaching, not a rescue team, but Garrett coming to finish the cleanup. The final relief came when Silas used his old rescue flares to signal a passing State Patrol helicopter, exposing the corruption and saving the canine family in a moment of pure frozen justice. The ice was already forming on Silas Thorne's eyelashes, turning the world into a blurred, jagged mess of grey and white. He couldn't see his own hands, but he could feel the frantic, rhythmic tugging on the leather lead in his grip. Bane, his yellow Labrador, was no longer walking, he was lunging. Every few feet the dog would bury his snout into a drift and let out a muffled, desperate bark that was instantly swallowed by the roar of the Colorado wind. Silas stumbled, his boots catching on a hidden root, and for a second the cold felt like a heavy blanket trying to pull him down into a permanent sleep. He forced himself up, his lungs burning with a sharp intake of frozen air. Bane stopped suddenly, his body going rigid as a board. Through the sheets of horizontal snow, a low, metallic clanking reached Silas's ears. It was the sound of iron hitting iron. He pushed forward, shielding his eyes, and nearly tripped over a mass of shivering fur. A mother dog, her ribs showing, through a matted coat, was huddled against a rusted logging winch. She didn't bark, she didn't move, she just looked at Silas with eyes that had already accepted the end. Beneath her, tucked into the hollow of her belly, 6 tiny puppies were piled together, a single mass of shaking limbs. They were chained. A heavy industrial-grade link was looped through the mother's collar and padlocked to the frozen winch. Silas felt a surge of heat in his chest that had nothing to do with the weather. This wasn't a mistake. This was a deliberate act of cruelty. He reached for his radio to call for a medevac, but as he keyed the mic, he heard only the flat, dead hiss of a jammed frequency. He looked at the padlock. It was covered in a thick layer of ice, the keyhole completely sealed. Silas pulled his tactical knife, trying to chip away at the frozen crust, but his hands were shaking so violently the blade slipped, slicing through his glove.
He didn't feel the pain, he only felt the vibration in the ground. It was faint at first, a low-frequency hum that grew into a mechanical growl. Someone was coming through the woods in a heavy vehicle. Silas looked at Bane, and the dog's hackles went up, a low growl vibrating in his throat that signaled danger, not rescue. Silas scrambled to the edge of the clearing, pulling Bane down into the deep powder. A massive, blacked-out snowcat roared into view, its heavy treads churning the snow into a dark slush. The door opened, and Chief Garrett stepped out, wrapped in a high-end thermal parka that cost more than Silas made in a month. Garrett didn't look for survivors. He walked straight to the logging winch, a heavy crowbar in his hand. He wasn't there to save the dogs. He was there to detach the winch and move the evidence of his illegal timber grab before the state inspectors arrived. Silas felt the world tilt. The man he had reported to for 5 years was standing 10 feet away, ready to let a mother and her pups be crushed or buried just to protect a paycheck. He saw Garrett raise the crowbar, aiming not for the chain, but for the winch's release lever. If that winch let go, the heavy timber attached to the cable further up the hill would slide down, burying the dogs in seconds. Silas didn't think. He didn't check his surroundings. He just lunged out of the snow, his voice a roar that cut through the engine's drone. "Get away from them!" Silas screamed, his hand moving toward his sidearm. Garrett spun around, his face a mask of shock that quickly curdled into a cold, hard sneer. He didn't drop the crowbar. He held it like a club. "You were told to stay at the station, Silas," Garrett said, his voice eerily calm over the wind. "Now you've gone and made this complicated." Garrett glanced at the dogs, then back at Silas, and his eyes went dead. Bane didn't wait for a command. The Labrador launched himself from the drift, 90 pounds of golden fury aimed straight at the chief's arm. The crowbar flew into the snow as Garrett went down, cursing and flailing. Silas ignored the fight, diving toward the mother dog. He jammed his knife into the ice around the padlock, his movements frantic. He could hear the groan of the cable up the hill. The timber was shifting. The weight of the storm had made the upper slope unstable, and Garrett's meddling had triggered the slide. "Run, Bane! Get back!" Silas yelled, but the dog was locked on to Garrett's sleeve, keeping the man away from the winch. Silas felt the padlock finally snap open as the ice shattered. He grabbed the mother dog by the scruff, dragging her and the pups toward the tree line, just as a massive wall of snow and pine logs thundered through the clearing. The sound was like a mountain collapsing. Silas felt the wind of the slide knock him flat, the world turning into a suffocating white void for a heart-stopping minute. When the snow finally settled, the clearing was gone. The winch, the snowcat, and the evidence were buried under 20 feet of debris. Silas pushed himself up, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked around wildly for Bane. "Bane, buddy!" he choked out, his voice failing. A few yards away, a patch of yellow fur emerged from the powder. Bane shook himself off, sneezing out snow, and immediately began digging at a spot near a fallen cedar. Silas rushed over, helping the dog move the heavy drifts. They found the mother dog and her 6 pups tucked into the natural shelter of the cedar's roots, untouched by the slide. They were scared, but they were alive. Silas collapsed against the tree, pulling the shivering mother into his lap. He looked toward where Garrett had been. The chief was gone, swallowed by the very mountain he had tried to exploit. Silas reached into his pocket and found his emergency flare. He fired it into the grey sky, a brilliant red streak that signaled the end of the nightmare. An hour later, the rhythmic thumping of rotor blades broke the silence. The state police helicopter lowered a rescue basket, and Silas watched if the puppies were lifted first, followed by their mother. As Silas climbed in with Bane, he looked down at the ruined clearing one last time. He knew the investigation would be long, and the betrayal would leave scars on the town, but as Bane rested his heavy head on Silas's knee, the only thing that mattered was the warmth returning to the Labrador's fur.